come so we can get some answers.
Yeah.
But the Lord gives us the answers anyway. We just have to be patient and follow His leading. Okay, Sabbath school lesson this morning. We've been working on Daniel for the whole quarter. This quarter we're on lesson number 4. It's another dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And some of you have been Adventists for a while. This will be a story you've heard before. But we want to have it apply a little bit differently. Not that that story's not great, but there's a bit of Nebuchadnezzar in each one of us. So as you read about Nebuchadnezzar, no, none of us are in charge of this humongous dynasty. But we have influence within our own arena. And so as we read Nebuchadnezzar, we'll bring it up from time to time. Don't think of Nebuchadnezzar, his only problem is the fact he's a great monarch. The struggles he faced are the struggles we all face with distractions and pride and other things associated with that. So as you read it, look at Nebuchadnezzar more as, do I do this? The same thing as Nebuchadnezzar does. So we'll spend most of our time in Daniel, and we're going to start out with Daniel. It's all going to be Daniel chapter 4 for the most part. There may be a couple other verses we'll go to, but for the most part, this is where we're going to spend our time. A lot of material to cover because it covers a lot in the Bible.
This is his testimony.
And I'm not starting in verses 1 through 3 because that's going to take more time. So yes, there may be some verses we will skip through just in the sake of time. It's a good opportunity for you to go back this afternoon and read it. And then you can sort of apply the things that we've discussed today that the Holy Spirit has shared with you. So starting with Daniel 4 and verse 4. Carol Lee, do you have that?
Yes. I want to comment. Last night as I was reading in our quarterly and read about Nebuchadnezzar, I said, we'll probably meet him in heaven.
Very good chance,
Give me
isn't there?
goosebumps when you say that, but yeah.
Because he was just praising God.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is his testimony. We all have testimonies. This is
You see, that's why the story of Nebuchadnezzar has application to us,
Right.
too.
Right, yeah.
So, yes, very good. This is the last we hear of Nebuchadnezzar, too, is in this chapter.
I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace.
Okay. Nebuchadnezzar had a great kingdom, did he not? He was at rest. He was flourishing in his palace. Do we not sometimes do a similar thing? Where we're very comfortable with the life we have. So then, Ellen White has a good quote in Prophets and Kings. It's not surprising that the successful monarch, so ambitious and so proud-spirited, should be tempted to turn aside from the path of humility, which alone leads to true greatness. Humility. Remember, we hammer on that quite often. Moses was one of the most humble people. But that alone leads to true greatness. That's not the world's greatness. The world's greatness would like you to be proud and arrogant. But God's greatness and true greatness, where people are benefited thereby, is with humility. In the intervals between his wars of conquest, he gave much thought to the strengthening and beautifying of his capital, until at length the king of Babylon became the chief glory of his kingdom. The city of Babylon became the chief glory of his kingdom. The golden city, the praise of the whole earth. When I read those two, or that sentence basically, it reminded me of King David. Remember, he got into trouble because he didn't go out to war, and he started looking around, and there was Bathsheba. And things went south for him there quickly. Sometimes idle hands are the devil's workshop. If you're not busy, you start thinking of things and doing things you shouldn't.
Well, Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah.
It was the Hanging Garden, so it was some incredible, you still hear about what it was.
His passion as a builder and his signal success in making Babylon one of the wonders of the world ministered to his pride. Now look what I have done. But don't we do that sometimes too? Until he was in grave danger of spoiling his record as a wise ruler who God could continue to use as an instrument for carrying out his divine purpose. God was able to use Nebuchadnezzar to reach the entire world at that time through the various activities since we've been gone. The burning fiery furnace, that would be one opportunity. The statue that preceded it. All these things were opportunities for the God of the Israelites to become known. So something very bad, they went into captivity, can turn out to be something good. Daniel 4, 5, and 6.
I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thought upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of my dream.
Okay, and the verse before, he's all at peace, everything's good, but the Lord sent him a dream that really troubled him. Don't be surprised if you're too much at ease, if something, the Lord doesn't shake you up. And it troubled him, so what did he do? Just like before, prior dream, he calls all the wise men because he has no clue what it means. So verse 7.
Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them. But they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof.
Couldn't do it the last time either,
But
right?
this one's interesting in that this time he knew his dream. Last time he had forgotten his dream and he needed to know it. This time he actually knew it.
But they still couldn't tell him what it meant, could they? Okay, how about 8 to 9?
But at the last, Daniel came before me. This name is Nebuchadnezzar. According to the name of my God, in him as the spirit of the Holy God, and I told the dream before him, saying, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the Holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the vision of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation.
You know, as I was reading through this is the same scenario. We're replaying what happened back in Daniel 2, where he had a dream. He went to the wrong people to get an answer. When something troubles us spiritually or otherwise, who do we go to get our answers? Do we go to our common friends? Or do we go to someone who has the Spirit of God? Yeah. He's no different than the rest of us. Sometimes, you know, I've always worked in a secular environment where the people that I'm surrounded by are generally not that interested in serving God. So do we go and get our answers to life's challenges from them, or do we get them from a man of God or a person of God? I don't want to be man in the sense of not. Diana's shared with me a lot of things that have helped me over the years.
One thing I do notice, last time he was pretty much kill them all, get rid of them all. This time he waited for Daniel to come. And I like that. But at last Daniel came.
You know, and yeah.
And the other thing is, he named him after my small g God. But actually, he's got the spirit of the Holy God, and I like that, where he's really seen who Daniel is at this point.
Right. And that's through Daniel's conduct through all the intervening period that we don't know about and don't read all the interventions that occur in the interim. But obviously, Daniel kept the right godly spirit with him. Prophets and kings, once more in this idolatrous nation, testimony was to be borne to the fact that only those who love and fear God can understand the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. The king, in his perplexity, sent for his servant Daniel, a man esteemed for his integrity and constancy and for his unrivaled wisdom. Where does wisdom come from?
God.
And we know that from what verse? Or what chapter, or what book?
I know it's
From James, right? James 1. If any of you lack wisdom, yeah. Like I said, sort of quizzes in there. It helps me when I try to remember what verses are.
Isn't it in Proverbs as well?
Proverbs is very good for wisdom, and in fact, further on we'll have a quote from Proverbs. Yeah, well, it was written by one of the wisest men, right?
Yeah.
Wisdom is something we are to seek, right? Yeah, very good. Okay, Daniel 4:10-17. See, Daniel's not getting sucked up with all this pride and everything else. Have you noticed that? This is a lot of reading, but I want to get through it so we know what the dream was about. Lena, you ready for about, 7 verses?
I'll try.
No tough names, I don't think, so go ahead.
These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong in height. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the fields found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off the leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth. Bound with this band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given a heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him.
One more, 17.
This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men.
Quite a dream. And the idea behind the dream is that someone would recognize that the Most High rules in the kingdom. Remember Nebuchadnezzar had that problem? He knew what the dream was in Daniel 2, where there were successive kingdoms. But when he put that, or created that statue that they were about to in the plain of Dura, what was the difference between the dream of Daniel 2 and the statue he created?
Full gold.
It was all him, wasn't it? Yeah. I will never be defeated.
Like you went.
My kingdom will last forever.
I don't remember where I read it. Maybe it was in the quarterly. But the thing is that gold is malleable.
It's soft.
It is weak. But iron is strong, even though it's less value. And that, on each of those was the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't pay attention to that.
No, he didn't.
He didn't want to be taken over. He knew the meaning, so he was going to keep it all gold.
Besides, I've got this great kingdom I have created. Who's going to take it from me? It's not possible, right? I control the entire world. But when God says otherwise, you should pay attention, right?
The one thing I also, it stands out is verse 17 where it says that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will. And we need to remember that God is in charge, even if we don't like who's in charge, humanly who's in charge, God's in charge.
Right.
So,
He gives it to whoever he will.
yeah,
So we can take great peace in that too.
right.
I have been talking to my sons, little by little, just giving them Christ is going to come,
Oh, yeah.
you know, and he's going to judge, and but before that, this country is not gonna be the same as it was.
Right.
And I heard one of them, oh, that's not possible, that can't be, you know, our country is strong, people won't let that happen. All these different little phrases I get.
You've probably seen changes just in your lifetime, and, yeah,
Oh, I have no doubt of it.
just,
Yep. And so hopefully the seed you plant will be remembered later when those events do come to pass, right?
Well, that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
That's what we pray for, right? Okay, verse 18.
O Belshazzar, that was the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now tell me what it means, for no one else can help me. All the wisest men of my kingdom have failed me. But you can tell me because the spirit of the holy gods is in you.
Is God being glorified? Yeah, because Daniel remains strong for him. He's the only one that can interpret the dream. None of the others were able to. Okay, so what does Daniel say?
Carolyn. Carolyn, do you wanna do that one? No, it's fine.
I'm just 19. And Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his heart spoke him. So the king spoke and said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies.
Anybody ever want to give bad news to their boss?
Especially when they wanted to kill all the wise men before.
Yeah, last time. Don't like to be the messenger of bad news, do you? And that's what Daniel's got. He says, King, may it not be on you, may it be your enemies that are going to get this treatment. But that's not the case here. Daniel 4:20 to 22.
The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O King, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown, and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth.
Ever heard of the family tree? Yeah, boy, if this is an example of family tree. Now, his influence was great, was it not? But I would suggest, how much influence does your family tree have where you started the family tree? Speaking from Diane and my perspective, we've got 10 grandkids, 4 kids, 10 grandkids. They're all over the U.S. We wish they lived nearby so we could enjoy them more often. But each of them have an influence in their own area there too. And their kids are having an influence with other kids that they encounter too. So when you think about Nebuchadnezzar, he had a great influence. His was the entire world. Obviously ours isn't that big. But any of you that have kids, know the influence that you have. If you're the center of it, which you are, like Helena says, I put these little thoughts in their mind because they will listen to you. Your influence has influence on others. So whether good or for bad, being a tree and being the main part of the tree is something that the Lord can benefit thereby, by having your people be a good influence. So yes, this is King Nebuchadnezzar, but this isn't any different than us. Your influence with others, whether it's at church or whatever, is greater than you think. Okay, a tree. I have found, and I'll give you the verses for it, that typically it's symbolic of a man. Clearly that's what Daniel said here. The tree is you, O king. But here's some other places where it talks about the similar thing. You've heard of the tree that bear good fruit. If it doesn't bear good fruit, it's cut down, and it's referring to people who bear good fruit. I see men like trees. This was a man who Christ was healing, who had blindness, and he healed him in stages. At first he couldn't see real well, so Christ asked him, what do you see? I see what looks like trees, or men look like trees, until he got his full sight. And then Ezekiel in 3 different chapters talks about green trees and dry trees. Dry trees have no life in them, sort of like a Christian is what he's referring to, whereas green trees have life in it still. So are you a green tree or a dry tree? You certainly want to be one of the green trees. And then some verses dealing with trees. Remember, there's a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil in the beginning. Art mentioned Proverbs earlier. Proverbs 3:18, she, which is wisdom, I added the word wisdom there because that's what it's referring to in the context, is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. So you want to be a tree of life? Have wisdom. Then Proverbs 11:30, the fruit of righteousness is the tree of life. Righteousness, basically being right doing, is a tree of life. And he that winneth souls is wise. Isn't that what we're here for, to win his souls? Revelation 22:2, you all know about this. In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruit. Remember, we read about this tree that had fruit abundant on it. And the leaves of the tree were the healing of the nations. And here you hear about the leaves. The birds are on the leaves and everything. And there will be the healing of the nations. So trees are used quite often in the Bible. The trees of Lebanon are spoken of as very beautiful. So anyway, trees are an interesting thing. And back to the dream, we know that Nebuchadnezzar was considered a dream. Or Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He was considered the tree. 23.
And inasmuch as the king saw and watched a holy one coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and the roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him.
There's a lot in there, isn't there? Some people like to say, oh, the Lord's really not paying attention to what's going on down here. This verse sort of indicates otherwise. Many others too, but there's a watcher. God is watching over us and what's going on down here. Now, Lena mentioned about the iron. You notice what they wrapped it with? Not with gold, right? But that stump put iron around it, because that would mean it's going to hold it strong, isn't it? Even though he was the king of gold, it was iron that was going to hold it, because as you say, it's much more malleable, right?
This verse kind of makes me, it's interesting. It's like, if you don't take out, we have an olive tree that the people before us cut it off, but left the stump. And now it's 30 feet tall. All these branches have grown out of that stump, and we've got a huge tree. Just like you tried to take out a camellia bush, but didn't dig out the stump. And now I have a little bush. But you know, if God didn't take it out by the roots, he trimmed it. He trimmed it off good and solid.
He intended for it to come back.
Yeah.
As we will read further in here. Also like that he was wet with the dew of heaven. When the children of Israel in the desert needed food, it came down with the dew of heaven. It is something that God provides, so it sort of showed God was watching over him. If you're hanging around with the beasts of the field as a human, how successful are you going to be at protecting yourself? Yeah, probably not so much. So it just shows that the Lord's going to keep an eye on him. He's going to take care of him. He didn't want him to die off. That was the promise that he made through the interpretation of the dream. So he'll eat in the feast with the beasts of the field. Can you get any lower as a human being? Where do the beasts of the field get their food? Do they plant fields? They pretty much have to rely upon what God gave them, right? And that's what Nebuchadnezzar's going to have to do. He's going to have to rely upon what God, and realize you got to rely upon God.
That must have been a hard thing after having the best of foods and wine and everything. Now you got to eat grass. Oh
A
my goodness.
vegetarian just like that.
With the mind that's not so good.
But you know, it's so
Yeah.
beautiful, and it doesn't say here, it doesn't say it Mrs. White's writings, but who knew about this other than Nebuchadnezzar would be Daniel. Daniel's the only one that knew who was second in charge, or had been told he was second in charge, was Daniel. God planned it out so that that kingdom wasn't going to be torn from him. Because if you knew that the president was eating grass for 7 years, or the king was eating grass, I mean, everybody would take over. They would destroy that kingdom to get in line for it. They did it all. They do it all the time now.
God said his kingdom was going to be restored.
And you know,
We'll get to that here, I think.
Also, real quick, just the fact that not only he was doing that, but his pride was so low to even think that all of these people that were around him all his life, he was mighty and powerful and all this, and they all know he's eating grass.
Yeah.
That must have just, you know, you just want to go under the ground.
Well, see, and this was a warning to him, so we'll get to it. He just, yeah, it was going to happen.
That's a,
That's the mystery belongs to God. The black cow who eats green grass and who gives white milk is a mystery. But we see the sovereign God, how he wants to save him from time to time through Daniel. But his heart is double heart. So Daniel, he's telling him, oh God, he said, oh Daniel, you are smart. No, king. I want to know you. I want to get to know who gets credit. There is a God in heaven who credits. There is no humiliation. Where there is humiliation, by humiliating the fear of the Lord are rich, honor, and life. That's Proverbs 24. So he has all the time double heart, double-minded. His heart is hardened and he can't understand. But one thing, God's will, God's wisdom will be revealed by those who are willing to understand God's will.
in fact, Casa, we will get to that in a moment, because that's right, we need to understand that.
Okay.
24:25.
This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and it gives to whoever, and gives it to whomever he chooses.
Yeah, be careful, don't be humbled by the Lord like this. If you, it's better to humble yourself.
But again, it shows God's in control.
Yep. And it was going to be a while, because he had a very proud heart, so it was going to take a little bit to work through it. Verse 26.
And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules.
I like that. Heaven rules. Yeah. So it's a good warning for each one of us, isn't it? If heaven's not ruling in our life, we could suffer the same peril. Okay, so this is sort of a little bit what Casa was saying, so is God forcing Nebuchadnezzar to serve him? I thought everybody had a freedom of choice.
Actually, maybe Nebuchadnezzar had been praying for something
He
too.
wanted to. He had the opportunity to change. I don't think that's forcing.
Okay. Here's a good passage. I love it in Ellen White. I read it every so often. Too many in planning for a brilliant future make another failure. Let God plan for you. As a little child, trust to the guidance of him who will keep the feet of his saints. God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led. If they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of his purpose, which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. Can't tell you the number of times as I look back on my life, I wanted to go this way and I wasn't able to go this way. I ended up going that way. I am so thankful to God that he took me in this other direction because it was far better than the direction I was going.
Even this week you've learned that. And it just continues.
All the time. But the key is, chose to be led. Remember, God always referred to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant, or frequently referred to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. And hopefully we'll have time to get to it.
It's next.
But when we get to the end, was he angry at God after the 7 years that he was eating with the beasts of the field? No, he was very happy, right? So Nebuchadnezzar could have gone down into the grave, but I sort of like the thought that we'll get a chance to see him in heaven. And it sure sounds like it based upon what we're reading, and it only is because the Lord did these miraculous things in his life. Because he was so prideful, because of the position he had. How many people in high position get prideful? Most of them, in reality.
Going back to the verse 17, the last line, and sets over it the lowest of men. Oh, I looked at that and I thought, okay, we got it.
The first shall be last and the last shall be first, right?
But I like the fact that he had willingness to humble himself.
Yes.
And that made him okay. And as you say, that we may be able to see him in heaven.
If you want to go to heaven, and you truly do, but your pride is interfering, the Lord will humble you because he knows you want to be led in that direction. So the greater the pride, the more humbling that will probably have to happen. For Nebuchadnezzar, 7 years. That's a long time. You would think 15 minutes doing that would have been enough.
Doesn't taste very good.
Well, he should have probably already known there was only one God in heaven. And when he's talking to Daniel, he keeps saying holy gods, as in there's more than one God that's leading Daniel. And so maybe this is his lesson.
Well, it's sort of interesting. How often do we forget that there is only one God? Because we get involved in the affairs of the world, and there are many other gods that interfere. It could be the God of what we eat, the God of what we drink, the God of the shows that we want to watch.
The sports God.
Very true. It can be the sports God. Whatever it may be that puts its place where God should be, these things distract us from God and get us another God in front of us. It doesn't matter what the name is of the God. Anything that takes the place of where God should be is a God. If you know you shouldn't be doing certain things and you do it, you're the same as Nebuchadnezzar. And we all go through this where we struggle with certain things. He surrounded himself with some of the worst people. Why didn't you get rid of these soothsayers and magicians and sorcerers and astrologers and all these folks? They're going to be a bad influence on you.
Well, they weren't
But he
earning
didn't
their
do
keep.
that.
They weren't earning their keep.
Well, apparently at other times they were, because he kept them, I guess.
I think when we look at it, those wise people, they are on the terror, but they don't understand this. But God told him, the God of heaven put you on the throne. The God of heaven gave you this authority. He never turned back. How many of us we say, oh, you did it. I did it. We don't give credit for God.
Oh, no.
The children, they learn that. Oh, you did it. They'll say. And what I want to read here, Proverbs 3, verse 5, we know all of us. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways and acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. And it will be health and your flesh and strength to your bone. That's what's the way we give credit to God, we humble ourselves. Why Jesus told them, the disciples, look at, this is God's will to reveal the secret for babies. Babies, they are humble. They depend on their parents. That's how He required.
I like he said, don't be wise in your own eyes.
Yeah.
Common translation, a legend in your own mind, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's where you run into problems. Now remember that my servant, we brought it up a few weeks back. Persons to whom God specifically referred to as my servant and put in their name on multiple occasions, not just one. There are a few instances where it's just one time. But on multiple occasions, Abraham, Moses, David, Job, Isaiah, Jacob, and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar does not fit with these other 6 people who are these great men of God. We don't think of Nebuchadnezzar that way. But in reality, he kind of is, but he was far more heathen than these other folks. But boy, did he not have a godly effect every time God put him in his place, where he gave God the credit, but then fell back in his own way, his own life. We do the same thing. God does great things in our life, and then we forget about him. We go through our day-to-day tasks. And then God does some great thing in our life because we're struggling. Let's give God the credit. And then we fall back the same way. So, and all these folks sinned. We know the story. Well, no, we don't know about Job.
No.
We don't know about any sin Job did. But certainly we know Moses had some issues, Abraham, David.
We don't know Isaiah.
I don't know about Isaiah. Jacob we know did. Yeah, so that's quite a
The
list of
Bible
people
says
to be part
all
of.
have sinned and fallen short of the glory
Right,
of
so
God.
we know we do.
They just didn't talk about it.
Right, we just don't know what it was. Daniel 4:27.
Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue.
Okay, the people of Nineveh, were they going to be destroyed?
Yeah.
Yes.
Were they destroyed?
No.
Because they repented of their ways, right? So, although that story occurred later, at least in the Bible, I think it occurred later, that principle does prevail in the Bible. And so if he could clean up his act, then maybe the Lord would hold back the punishment. But we know that didn't happen. And notice what he said one of the problems was? Okay, you need to be righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Apparently he didn't have much concern for the poor, did he? That's a problem we all have, is sometimes we don't care about those that are less fortunate. Especially the more money you make, you think everybody else should be able to do the same. We talked about this verse a couple quarters ago, but it's all of Isaiah 58. But this is 58:7. Is it not, these are things that we need to correct in our lives. It's a good last time chapter to keep us on target. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou being poor that are cast out, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thy own flesh. We all have problems. The poor are no different. But we are to take care of the poor. That's our responsibility. He didn't do that. So was he the merciful, beneficial benefactor that God wanted him to be. He wasn't. He needed some refining like all of us do. For a time, the impressions and the warning of the counsel of the prophet were strong upon Nebuchadnezzar, but the heart that is not transformed by the grace of God soon loses its impressions of the Holy Spirit. If it doesn't affect you and carry into your life, you will revert back. Self-indulgence and ambition had not yet been eradicated from the king's heart, and later on these traits reappeared. Notwithstanding the instructions so graciously given him and the warnings of the past experience, Nebuchadnezzar again allowed himself to be controlled by a spirit of jealousy against the kingdoms that were to follow. His rule, which heretofore had been to a great degree just and merciful, became oppressive. Hardening his heart, he used his God-given talents for self-glorification, exalting himself above God, who had given him life and power. None of us use our God-given talents for self-glorification, do we? Never have, never will, right? That's why I say Nebuchadnezzar is no different than the rest of us. Sometimes we exalt ourselves and should not. We should be humble. 28 to 33. Now we hear the answer to it all.
Okay. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as an oxen, and 70 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws.
So how did he look?
Not pretty.
Not pretty, huh?
The only other person is kind of almost described like this was the crazy man in the grave, in the cemetery that Jesus healed. You know, and I saw some little thing, it grew in 7 days. Well, I know that's not true. Nails don't grow like that in 7 days. Hair doesn't grow like that in 7 days. We believe at times is a year.
And there's that biblical prophecy, times, and half a time. And we know from history that a time means a year.
I think Miriam also, when she loved Moses because he married an Ethiopian lady, he strike with leprosy. But when Moses insisted him, he prayed, and God told him, put her 7 days, the dark, then she will be healed. In 7 days she was dead. 7 is so significant here. You should also half an hour is 7 days. When Jesus comes from heaven, it takes to be silent half an hour. That is 1 week. Once a week is prophetic time. So those who are not do not get the chance to keep the Sabbath here, as long as we are traveling this space, we're going to keep the Sabbath somewhere in this space. Then if they're going to get the seed of the Sabbath, then they have to go to eternal life.
Well, the number 7 is important.
Important is.
Usually it means complete, like the week, 7-day week, it's complete, and you start a new week. His transformation, as we're going to read in the following verses, was complete. And that's why we think there's a good chance he'll be in heaven.
And there's something else that's kind of interesting with this thing. It talks about when he opened his mouth, and it said it talked about, let me see, he was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. Before it was Nebuchadnezzar said, I did this, I heard this, and all of a sudden it's his. almost like that little part, he doesn't remember what exactly happened. And then it goes back to I again, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of filling in that little bit of the story that he wasn't writing.
Well, and I sort of like, you know, again, I want to try to correlate it to us. Is this not the great Babylon up in verse 30 that I have built for my royal dwelling by my mighty power and by the honor and for the honor of my majesty? People do that with homes and cars and whatever it is, careers. Yeah, look how successful I am, as opposed to how successful God has made me. So that I thing gets in there and interferes with humility, doesn't it? Nina?
I'm thinking of that period of 7 years and his mind. He had to have been somewhat aware of what was happening.
We're going to get to that in the next verse.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so let's look at verse 34 and 35.
And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand, or say to him, what have you done?
Okay, so what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He lifted his eyes to heaven.
Well, after his understanding returned, he lifted his eyes, and then his understanding.
And then his understanding returned to him. As soon as he recognized it, fully understood, like you were saying, Lynn, he had to have something. He did.
His memory was there.
He had something going on that he could look up to heaven and say, in essence, God help me. You know, I'm recognizing, and again, it mentions it again. I'm in charge. You are not in charge. And that's the battle he had to deal with.
And, excuse me, and in this community, we all know this. So we may not be verbally saying something, but he hears our thoughts. And
He knows our thoughts, right?
He knows our thoughts. So, you know, you're not maybe saying it, but you gotta watch
When you
it.
believe it, right? Yeah, he knows the hearts of it. Yeah. I like what it says in James 4:10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. That's pretty much what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, and can happen with us. You can humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. He did that with Nebuchadnezzar here. I mean, how realistic. Everybody is always seeking to kill off a king so they can be in charge. That commonly occurs. Here was a perfect opportunity, but the Lord had this in such control that no one was taking over his kingdom. He made sure of that and replaced him back on there, even though 7 years had passed.
That's a long time.
I mean, that's why you have a cupbearer, right? Because somebody's trying to poison you. When we read Nehemiah, you know, and how the king noticed when his countenance was a little bit different. Is this guy rebelling against me? Doesn't like me so much? What is it? God had this so much in control that even the king that was, for all intents and purposes, dethroned, still got his kingdom back. That just doesn't happen.
So that, without it being said, Daniel was in fact the acting king.
It would certainly appear, based
appears
upon
that way.
what we know about Daniel and how high the king had made him.
I was just looking at verse 17, and it said, God gives it to whomever he will and sets over it the lowest of men. Well, a slave could be one of those lowest of men. So Daniel came in as a slave.
Well, the lowest of men, what is that? It means a person who is humble,
And humble.
right?
So maybe that is a little clue. But we do know it was preserved, and only God's going to do that.
And only God could, because that's not in man's nature. Verse 36.
Where are we going?
Starting over again.
Caroline?
Oh,
At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, My honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me.
Excellent majesty. Okay, so he reverted back to where he was, right? Which is pretty bizarre considering where he was. Sure, after a good haircut and some nail trimming, he probably looked pretty normal again.
Pedicure.
He probably,
Yeah,
looked,
pedicure,
he
huh?
probably looked a lot healthier after he got that healthy stuff.
Yeah, that may be true too. But I like, what do you think is meant by excellent majesty was added to me? So he got something more than he did before.
And something that the Lord gave him, as far as character.
Well, we know what his shortcoming was before, right? We read it in verse 27. Break off your sins by being righteous and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Do you think he got that?
Humbleness, probably.
Yeah.
I think he got that finally and realized there were some things he needed to change in his life. So that added to his majesty. Can you imagine working under a person like that who has been truly transformed by God? And what weaknesses you had, he was willing to get rid of.
God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That's what.
Yep. And so he got that, didn't he? Last verse, 37.
Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his way judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase.
Yeah, there's a lot in that one verse, isn't there?
In mine, base, it says put down. So he's kind of.
Well, he did it with Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most prideful people we probably would read about in the Bible. Down all the way to the chewing grass like the beasts. But I love what he says about God. All your works are truth. Your ways are justice. And those that walk in pride, he will humble. Isn't that great? Because boy, would people get along better if that was done in each of our lives. So again, Nebuchadnezzar is a story for us, not just because of what Christ did in his life, but really what Christ can do in each of our lives. We're not a lot different. We have influence with people that are around us. And whether we have an influence for good or for bad, that's dependent. But I think the latter kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar was far better than the first and had a greater impact for God. And he sent this letter to everybody about what happened here.
All his kingdom.
Nothing like a personal testimony to help convict souls.
I would like to read Ellen G. White's essay, Desire of Age 317. Successful work for Christ depends not so much on numbers or talent as upon the pureness of purpose through simplicity, earnest, dependent faith on God. We see the sovereignty of God and wisdom with this Galilean fought, Galilean Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They turned upside down Babylon. We see the disciples, they turned upside down the world. God, he always depends on the minority, and he did a great job. He does a great job. Well, but without the Holy Spirit, we can't do. How many pastors, elders we have in the regular church? But we couldn't even reach the world. And this says Ezekiel 9, chapter 9, verse 3, it says, now that's what happened for Israel. Probably for spiritual Israel, for our church. Now the glory of God of Israel had gone up from the cherubim where it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed with linen, that's Jesus, who had the right ink horn at his side. When the Holy Spirit is taken them from Israel, all the time They just silvery, immorality, infidel, all type of, and they don't understand maybe the profit. If we take the Bible for unbeliever, whether he's professor or doctor, and read this person, watch his feels, he can't understand without God's way.
Yeah, we need the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. Everybody's over there.
I know.
Do we want to go, leave it the way, we change it every morning to put it like this? Are we sort of beyond the circle kind of thing? And would we
You guys like the
prefer to
desk?
leave all those tables out there for everybody? Because we sort of collapse a couple and pull chairs from other places. Do people have a preference?
Either that or we smell funny.
Gone for 2 weeks and look what happens.
I know.
Do people have a preference one way or the other?
Who does this?
We
Who
do.
does it?
Yeah?
We get here to.
Well, early on, when this class started, everybody wanted this round table type discussion, but people have come and gone and everything, and sometimes things just change. And so I don't want to keep collapsing the tables and do all this if people would prefer the tables, because we don't really have a round group so much. Is there a preference?
Phyllis
with
has a
anybody?
comment.
Phyllis.
I just personally prefer the table because it has
set your
a
Bible
good
Yeah, I
place
do the same.
to sit because I don't have much of a lap.
Plus, you can see the screen better
Oh.
from here. If you're over there, or I was up there, I couldn't see it at all.
That's
So,
true.
when you're back here, you can see the screen better.
We could still put a few because some people
Yes.
that were having hearing issues were saying they couldn't hear when it was stacked up. So we could still put a few.
Well, if the tables were brought this way,
Exactly. That's
and
what
then
I
put
was
some
just gonna
chairs
say,
in front
maybe we
of.
could move the tables up a lot closer,
Yeah.
and, then, I mean, Goodmunder feels more comfortable in a classroom situation. So
He's
for
a
the
teacher.
2 weeks, it was like this, right?
Okay.
So, I know.
Well, and I just want to know what you folks prefer, and it sounds like having it more with the tables seems.
No,
like
first
preference.
week when Good Mentor came, he was all by himself when I walked in, and he was trying to make the circle. So he wanted to go with whatever was going
What
on.
we've done over the
He's
years.
such a blessing. We're so
Yeah,
glad he
so
could take it.
let's not feel that he was the one who.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's
I've
just
sort of
about-
noticed it, that people are enjoying the tables over time. So I've been meaning to see what people want in this. I don't have a preference one way or the other. It's what helps you folks the best. So we'll just maybe even put a row of chairs in front of the tables for those that want to sit in. Those who get a little
Those that
closer,
are
that'd
late
be
can
fine,
come and
too.
sit in the front row. That's
Jonathan.
I think the one thing, I do prefer sitting on the table, obviously, but I think one thing we should keep in mind is trying to maintain a conversational atmosphere, not like a teacher.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's I think why the circle.
Right,
idea.
right.
We
Yeah.
enjoyed the circle because we were more of a, yeah.
So let's weigh how it works if we go with the tables and see if we keep the conversational part still active, or whether it changes that, because we can change back too if we don't like it.
All good points.
All right, Art, do you mind offering our closing? Oh,
Lena has a
excuse me.
question.
There are usually people in all of these chairs,
Yeah.
and these are regulars. Where are they?
I don't know, we weren't
Well-
here.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know. And even some of the regulars, even Rose, I noticed walk from here back there. Sometimes it's just easier.
No, but she's saying like, where's Doris? Doris is
I don't know
probably
where
in
they are.
Florida.
Yeah,
I
don't know where they
Pam and
are.
Glenn have problems with sleeping.
With Pam, and.
I know she has problems with sleeping, so sometimes they make it to church, but not Sabbath school.
I think Bonnie and Joe are out of town.
Yeah, they try to escape around tax or before or after tax season.
Maybe their last escape before
Yeah.
taxes.
Yeah.
But you're right,
Yeah.
you're right.
Keep this in the back, that way.
Hmm?
I said, for me, I could put this in the back and it.
Oh, yeah, so for you it'd work better. Okay.
We do so much cheaper.
Well, we'll have a little bit of both, and if need be, we can do a little bit of this, but we'll try to keep the tables a little bit more like they are when we come in the morning.
Saves some work.
There you
And
go.
then whoever changes it during the middle of the week, they won't have to do anything either, so.
There you go.
All right, Art, you mind offering our closing prayer?
you so much for this beautiful Sabbath day you've given us.
Amen.
Thank you so much for also bringing Richard and I back in safety, and for the lessons that we've had today. What a wonderful lesson. Pride to humility, and a lesson that it's given to all of us. Lord, as we go about our lives, please